Hey everyone, welcome to CNBC TechCheck's live stream. I'm happy to be joined today by two fantastic entrepreneurs. They are the co-founders of the first LGBTQ focused digital bank in the United States. I'm joined by Robert Curtis, as well as Billie Simmons, both co-founders again of Daylight. Rob, Billie, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Brendan, for having us.
Thanks, Brendan.
Of course, of course. And congratulations. The news on which you are joining us is closing a $5 million seed funding round. So closing out Pride Month, making that announcement yesterday on the last day of the month. So congratulations on that. But before we dive into the funding and your intentions for the funding and a little bit more about the work that you're doing, I just hope, Rob, if you could just lay a little bit of a foundation for those who are joining us on what Daylight is, the work that you're doing, and sort of lay the roadmap and start it there.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Curtis, CEO and co-founder of Daylight. Daylight is the first and only digital banking platform designed for the LGBT community, and we describe it as a bank account that rewards you for spending in line with your values. And there's a reason for that. Our job is to do two things. Firstly, is to help close the LGBT wealth gap by providing great banking services to our community, because our community doesn't have the best experience in banking. There's a lack of expertise, there's a lack of support, there's sometimes even a lack of dignity and respect from the people that work in those industries. So that's the first part. But the second part is to help our community that is incredibly loyal, incredibly value, and really big, 30 million Americans who spend more than $1 trillion a year, which is almost the GDP of Mexico, to help them make sure that as an economic bloc, we are spending in line with our values. And that means not supporting companies that are putting rainbow stickers on their social media during Pride Month, while also funding anti-trans bills and anti-trans and anti-LGBT politicians. So our job is to create great banking services, but really to close the LGBT wealth gap for a community that's been left behind in financial services for a really long time.
And I find that interesting because I think that, we've heard of neobanks targeting other demographics, other underserved populations. And so now yours, focusing on the LGBTQ community. What are some of those, right? Like, let's lay the roadmap. What are some of those foundational needs that exist within the LGBTQ community that those who are less familiar may not be aware exist?
Sure, I can take this one if you like.
Yeah,
so, when we think about the ways in which LGBT people's money is different to non-LGBT people's money, it really starts when they're a child. So, we are more likely to have student debt because we are more likely to be rejected by our families when we come out. And so we're less likely to have familial financial support. And, as you go throughout the life of an LGBT person, you see all these different financial barriers. We're paid less. We are less likely to have a mortgage. We're less likely to have a healthy savings habit. And, a really interesting thing happens when LGBT people reach sort of middle age. They're faced with, well, you can either have a home or you can have a child. And the reason for that is the average cost of having a child when you're an LGBT couple is $55,000. And, a down payment for a home is usually about that much too. And, as we kind of continue through our lives, if we're trans, often transition surgeries can cost up to $100,000. And it means that when we reach retirement, we are 40% less likely to have enough money to live off during retirement, partially because of all of these kind of, existing financial barriers, but also because we want to retire somewhere where our identity is going to be respected, where we're not, unsafe. And that usually means coastal cities with a higher cost of living. So there's kind of all of these, big financial barriers. And then I think the other interesting trend that we're seeing now, as Rob kind of said, is that LGBT people want to support their own community, and they want to do it in a way that, divests from big banks and these large companies that, change their social media icon to rainbow during the month of Pride, but are donating to anti-LGBT politicians at the same time. And they want to put their money back into their community and do it in a way that is seamless with their banking experience.
And we'll come full circle to the rainbow washing conversation as well, because again, I think as we head into Pride 365 24/7, right, we're outside of Pride Month. That's a conversation I definitely want to have with both of you. But I want to hit on a point that you bring up about the traditional financial institutions. I think that digital banking has seen such a increase in interest because people are trying to divest and remove themselves from those traditional mediums. Now, I think that includes the LGBTQ community, but I think it expands to others. And so, to start, is Daylight a service that allies are also invited to use, or is this something that is specifically for the LGBTQ community?
I think that's a really great question. I mean, we have a very open tent, and there's a reason for that. It's because LGBT progress has been made with the support of a huge number of allies. And if you look at the size of our market, there's 30 million LGBT folks. That means there's 60 million parents out there of LGBT kids. Now, let's be generous, 3/4 of them want to be supportive of their child. They should want to make sure that they are educated well, that if they're living on the breadline, that they have support systems in place, and that when they go into a bank teller, that they're treated with dignity and respect. And so by focusing on values-led customers, people that want to put their money to work without having to even think about it to support the LGBT community, we have space for LGBT folks, our chosen families, which sometimes are queer folks, sometimes aren't, our real families, and our families to come, because 61% of LGBT folks want to have kids. So I think the way we see our community is changing, and the way our community is going to look in the future is going to change. And so rather than just say this is for queer people only, this is very much a platform that gives better advice to queer folk than they'll find anywhere else, that gives products that are really suitable for many folks. Take fertility treatment. That can be really suitable for many people that are having fertility problems, but we're going to make it easy for LGBT folks to have families. So I think very much we see the world as a place where LGBT people are centered in a banking service, which is kind of the opposite of what we get at the moment. We are marginalized in a banking service. So we welcome anybody that wants to support our community, support the LGBT ecosystem as a whole, and make sure that the LGBT people around them are loved, cared, and supported for.
If you're just tuning in, I want to just sort of reset the conversation here. We are joined by the co-founders of the first LGBTQ digital bank in the United States, Rob Curtis and Billie Simmons. And we are just continuing the conversation on their recent announcement of securing $5 million in their seed round. And so I want to talk about that funding specifically now as we continue the conversation. Rob, could you speak a little bit to your intentions now that you have that funding secured? What are the next steps? I know you're eyeing, a hard launch of actually getting, cards in hands of individuals who have been otherwise on your wait list.
Yeah, thank you. So we currently have hundreds of users already in a closed beta. We are engaging with them every day. We're watching them spend. We know where their favorite merchants are. And we call them our Daylight builders because we think of ourselves as an LGBT bank built for and by the community. And that means every single member of our platform. So these are people that are helping us prioritize features, helping us engage around content and education that's important to them. In October, we'll be releasing our full product suite. That'll be a checking account, that'll be a merchant-funded rewards program that connects LGBT vendors and large retailers that may not support LGBT community as deeply, but who will be sending charitable donations from them as part of the discounting strategy. We'll be making Paycheck available early, which is really important for a community that's more likely to have unstable incomes. And very much from October onwards, we're going to be onboarding tens of thousands of customers as we start looking ahead to our Series A, so that we can continue to grow and grow and grow. And I think what's been really comforting and really enjoyable about this latest funding round is while it was very difficult to get there, LGBT founders are often funded only 10% as often as non-LGBT folks. We've pulled together a coalition of fintech venture capitalist firms, consumer venture capitalist firms, and even incumbent banks like Citibank and JP Morgan, who recognize that the future of banking is around deep personalization for communities. And so that means that it's not just a kind of a team of queer millennials trying to solve our own problems with a great idea anymore. We're now an integrated part of the financial system. And I think that's very much the direction we want to take this company. We're building the largest lifestyle and financial services company in the world for our community.
Well, and those partnerships, right, and they lend credence to the work that you're doing, and also sort of, support in the sense that, I'm not going to call it validation, but I'll call it, for someone who's trying to figure out if they're going to transition over to Daylight. Which I guess my question then is, do you expect Daylight to be someone's sole primary source of banking, or do you see it as sort of a secondary account with more targeted resources?
I think our goal really is to be the primary account for the LGBT community and for our allies as well. If I said to you, by switching over all of your, banking setup and just doing your normal spending, you could funnel money back into our community while also getting cashback rewards to yourself. It's very clear there that the more you spend, the more you're helping the community. And so our goal really is to provide a best-in-class suite of products that match any incumbent bank, and then go one step further and provide products tailored specifically for the LGBT community.
And I think one of the things
actually another. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
One of the things that we consistently hear from our customers is that while they're feeling some of these financial pain points really acutely, lack of access to families, lack of access to credit to support transitions, just being asked what your wife does at the teller, those things are unpleasant and uncomfortable for our community, and they can be real financial pain points. But the one thing that brings together every customer that we talk to is this real desire to want to march with their feet and support the LGBT bank, because I think they recognize that big banks have done too little to help our community. They've seen us as a marketing opportunity. That's why we get lots of rainbows on cards. We don't need rainbows on cards. We need cash. We need support for people less privileged than ourselves, and we need services that are tailored towards our community. And so the thing that brings everybody together almost consistently of every member that signed up is a real desire to shift their banking towards the LGBT bank so that they can put their money into action without even having to think about it.
And this is also a clarifying question, because I do notice that one of the intentions of the company is to support LGBTQ businesses by offering that cashback program, which Billie, you mentioned. But I also know that typically, neobanks or digital first banks, a lot of their revenue comes from fees that are charged on transactions that are made with cards. And so if those transactions are being made at LGBTQ owned businesses, and typically at a slightly higher rate when those transactions are done with a digital bank, how are you navigating that to make sure, right, that the intention behind the program is still being followed through on? I just like making sure that entrepreneurs aren't being overpaying for fees.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think the status quo is that vendors are paying interchange revenue to large network providers like Visa and MasterCard all of the time. We make a share of our profit from transactional fees, irrespective of whether these are LGBT businesses, big box retailers, you name it. Our goal with businesses is not to burden them with fees, but is to redirect customers in their direction, to provide alternatives so that people can spend in line with their values. So if you're going to a coffee shop on the way to work and Daylight could nudge you and say, this month you went to this coffee shop, but did you know that there's a queer-owned and queer-friendly one just 3 doors down? Our goal is to redirect customers to LGBT businesses, which can find it hard to acquire customers because it's expensive to acquire customers today. Facebook and Google take incredible cuts out of almost every company's customer acquisition strategy. And so if we can drive footfall to these businesses, we can, the data shows that merchant-funded reward programs increase loyalty, increase average spend per customer. And so actually we see this as a net benefit for the companies that we're trying to bring into the ecosystem, because money doesn't stay in the LGBT economy very long. And for us to build intergenerational wealth, that's going to have to change. And we see Daylight as a real driver for improving the situation for LGBT businesses rather than just trying to monetize them.
And I think about, the fact that digital banks have been so geared towards driving change, right? So there's a bunch that seem, especially during the pandemic in the last year when everyone was looking to go digital, so many have popped up. And so just a couple of names that I've written down, right? You have Greenwood and First Boulevard, who are targeted towards Black Americans. You have Cheese, geared toward Asian Americans. Purple is for people with disabilities. So, and I think about how when we're talking about diversity, we're always talking about how individuals operate at an intersection of identity. and LGBTQ may be one of those intersections. So when I have this platter of so many options and so many communities and identities that I associate myself with, how am I choosing between all of those identities and knowing who I should support with that car, with that bank account? Billie, I don't know if maybe you want to weigh in here.
Sure. I think it's really down to the consumer. We don't really see this as a zero-sum game. We love all of those companies. Particular shout out to First Boulevard. We're huge, fans with them, and we're very connected, and we have calls very regularly with the founders of First Boulevard and share a lot of insights because the market is large enough for all of us to succeed, and I think all of us have a much higher chance of succeeding if we all succeed together. In terms of where we see Daylight fitting into that, certainly starting with values-based spending towards the LGBT community, but there's no reason that can't expand to racial justice or to the environment or to reproductive rights, because actually, to your point, a lot of consumers have very intersectional values, and they care about not just the LGBT community, but also all of these other things. And so I think when we think about expanding, that's definitely in mind. It's important to vote with your feet, not just about one issue, but about all of the issues that you care about. And I think, ensuring that companies meet the standards that you have for your own personal values is becoming increasingly important to consumers. And I think that, we see ourselves as a platform to highlight those intersectional needs.
And Rob, I guess I would double down on that question and just ask, right? I know you set the intention to have 10,000 active customers by the time of launch. Again, I'm sure that thought process is going through individuals' minds while they're thinking about which card to go with, which bank to be banking with. How has sort of your recruitment been, in terms of finding individuals who want to be Daylight customers? What is your strategy behind that?
We've had 3 really successful strategies for the business. The first is through earned media, conversations like this. A big part of what we had to do to raise money, to build a case for why Daylight should exist, is educate not only our own community, but the financial community at large about how there is a gender and sexuality dimension to finances, which is something that hasn't really necessarily been recognized as strongly until November, December, when we started kind of shouting from the hilltops about it. And earned media has been a really great way for us to spread the word. The second is we've been working with existing community groups. So if I give you a couple of examples, there's a wonderful organization called Start Out, which is a 501c3 focused on building LGBT entrepreneurs. We are very close to that team there. So that gives us access then to a network of LGBT entrepreneurs that are thinking about their banking. And we're also working with an organization called Out in Tech. In fact, Billie and I met on stage at a Google panel a number of years ago when we were talking at an Out in Tech event. And they have 40,000 LGBT technology workers who are coming together for job support, financial support, and really support navigating through the workplace. And so by engaging with them in the places that they are, co-hosting events in their Slack channels, we found a huge amount of customers are coming along because folks that join LGBT community organizations, whether that's the Lesbian Knitting Circle or the Queer Volleyball Club, they're often thinking about their community at the very front of their identity. And so they're a really great place for us to engage authentically with our community. But the strategy that's been working really well for us as we've been scaling is by reaching people in social media and LinkedIn and Instagram. So what we're finding is that our cost of acquisition for LGBT folks is incredibly, incredibly low because this is a fresh idea. We are used to taking table scraps. And I think the idea that our money is not going to be treated with the sense of shame that we often are made to feel about ourselves as queer people. They know that they can come into a safe place, that they're going to get advice that is tailored to them. And we're there to help them to understand whether they're doing the right thing. And I think really simple messages, no more what does your wife do, cuts through really well, no more dead naming. These are short sentences that we can match with creative on social networking that bring huge amounts of customers to our door. And I think that 10,000 customers that we've been talking about, we're growing 10% week on week. We'll have that on our wait list before we even go to launch. So I think growth for us has been a real strong point for the company.
And I think beyond that, I think whenever I hear the words digital first, or I hear, anything in the tech space, I think about the technology gap as well. And so I think about, right, in this case specifically, say that 18-year-old who comes out, is kicked out of the home, is already struggling to figure out X, Y, and Z, maybe doesn't have Wi-Fi, maybe doesn't have a smartphone, maybe doesn't have access, but you still want to engage with that customer, right? So are you prepared, and do you have sort of the resources to do that extra bit of outreach that might be needed for individuals that in this community, as you've already expressed, are sort of on the margins and may need extra resources?
So right now, we are focused on values-based LGBT consumers, their chosen families, and their real families. We are focused on the middle of the market. So these are folks that aren't living on the breadline right now, but they're not wealthy enough that they're paying a JP Morgan wealth advisor to help them navigate through some of the nuances of LGBT money. As we grow, we have what we call our have our cake and eat it strategy, which is we start leaning into wealth management, which is a more profitable area of business, things like credit cards, which generate higher fees for the business, in order to support more active engagement for people that are financially excluded from the system. Right now, the best thing we can do as an early stage startup is to make sure we are channeling as much direct support as we can to organizations that go to support those kinds of folks. So every one of our events takes money and gives it to a mutual aid fund, and we try and aim for charities and mutual aid funds that pass 90 to 95% of all donations directly to an LGBT person in need. So I think we're very much building this infrastructure out, but our goal is to not only be global, but to support people across the full wealth spectrum for the LGBT community. But we're very much starting with folks that are looking to switch their existing bank account over. It is a mobile first experience. And for folks that are unable to afford a mobile, maybe they're living in a homeless shelter or they've just been rejected by their family, our method of helping them right now is not to give them a bank account that has no money in it, is to channel funds directly to a mutual aid fund, to a charity that's going to put money into their hands as quickly as possible. But very much we see a financial inclusion journey as being one of the next steps of our overall journey as a company.
And even just throughout this conversation, I would love to just end, and I said I would come back here to the idea of rainbow washing and just this conversation of what we sort of are now ushering into, which is the other 11 months of the year beyond Pride Month, right? And so much of what you've discussed, you've really highlighted what you're doing that is for the LGBTQ community by the LGBTQ community. And, I do think that June serves as a platform for great progress, but obviously that work has to continue. So I wonder, in speaking with investors and trying to, drum up interest in your business as LGBTQ entrepreneurs, what does that process look like for the next 11 months, especially in the banking sector?
Well, of course, for us, LGBT wealth and the LGBT community is a focus and a priority all year round. And I think, our strategy with our partners, with our investors, is to encourage them to do the same. So, every partner that we take, every investor that we take, we hold them to standards, to the same standards that we hold ourselves. And we ask them, very directly, what are you doing in a tangible way to help the LGBT community? Not just throwing a party in June, or not just sponsoring a pride float, but what are you actually doing for our community? How are you making our lives easier? And I think that by holding ourselves to those standards and holding all of our partners to those standards, we're really starting to see, that needle move. There's a ton of goodwill. I think, something that Rob and I have experienced when partnering with these companies is there are LGBT people at those companies that are just waiting for the sort of bat signal to show up to say, it's time to get some work done. And it has been, a really great experience partnering with, our investors like Citibank or City Impact Fund and JP Morgan, as well as, smaller VCs and investors and funneling money into the community. So, our banking partner, Marqeta, we've done a range of events during Pride Month, but we're also producing financial education content, for LGBT people that will come out throughout the next couple of months, because this is not just a one and done situation. And I think, that's really just our entire, MO and focus. We held a campaign just before Pride Month called Call Me By My Name, which called for incumbent banks to redirect some of their Pride spending and do a feasibility study to see how they can better include trans and non-binary customers. Can't say that the response from incumbent banks was particularly inspiring or exciting, but we will continue to push that and push these messages because it is at the core of everything that we do. And our goal is for LGBT people to have freedom of choice as well. We want to see these standards and this effort happening across the entire industry.
And I think one of the things we're really excited about is we see Daylight as being able to put competitive pressure on incumbent banks to know that they need to look at their LGBT folks differently, but also to show the world what good can look like. And I think as we move out of Pride season, we'll be releasing a tool called Walk the Walk, which will allow consumers to look at their spending, to be able to look at some of the merchants that they're spending with, and to get analytics and insights into how queer-friendly that company is. Now, let's say you are looking at AT&T, right? They look great at Pride season, but they've spent over $1 million directing money towards anti-LGBT and anti-trans causes. So what we can do is then empower our customers to say, well, why don't you shop here? And so continue to apply that retail pressure, not just to incumbent banks, but to retailers, to some of the services that we use every day, because we are focused on people that are aligning their values. And one of the hardest things to do is to understand whether actually you're living in accordance with your values every day, using your card, making payments, using your banking. And so by empowering our customers with tools, by empowering them with suggestions and alternatives, our goal is to put pressure at through industry, at retail, utilities, banking, you name it, because I think as we can start to channel this $1 trillion economic block into companies that are more actively supporting our community, we hope that people will begin to see that there is a solid economic case for doing better.
Well, and just to hopefully, wrap something like a bow around that point, right? It's about intention and then outcome, and outcome is what's tracked, is within the community at the end of the day. And again, Billie, just to speak to something that you mentioned, right? I think so much of this, phrase that someone once said to me when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's about, being invited to the party. It's about being asked to dance. And then it's also about knowing the music, right? Like being in on what it is that actually makes this experience so special and so unique. So congratulations to both of you again on raising the $5 million in this funding round. Fantastic to have you join us on CNBC to discuss it, and looking forward to keeping in touch as you continue to grow.
Thanks everybody for your time. Thanks for having us on the show.
Thanks, yeah.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Billie.